recording these. We will start in 2 minutes, just to let people arrive. The ones that are supposed to be here, get to be here. But just take the 2 minutes to settle in. Maybe you even want to close your eyes and take a few grounding breaths. Maybe you can't do that because you're moving. Whatever you need for 1 minute, give yourself that to arrive fully. Okay, so we said 3 minutes past, and it's 3 minutes past. So let's begin. Welcome to the second part of the Regenerative Business Transformation. This webinar series, or however you want to call that, that we are doing. And that's really annoying that it's giving me something like that. There we go. I'll be talking today, and today we'll deal with the systemic aspects of this transformation. And so we'll see. I have an ambition to make it as concrete as possible. And when you talk about the systemic, it's sometimes hard to make it concrete. So let's see if I succeed. I'd love for, those of you that can, just like bring the chat up and check in with a word. What emotion, what's the dominating emotion in your life, in your body right now? One word on what's the dominating emotion. What are you feeling right now? Beautiful. Framåtlutning. Yeah, lean in. Nice. All right, let's get going into this stuff. We'll see where it needs to take us. And I'm not allowed to apparently do things that I want to do. There we go. So Innrwrks is hosting these webinars. Nils and I have founded Innrwrks, and we are a transformation lab and studio. I'm very annoyed by these little things that pop up on the screen. We build tools, we start ventures, we're a venture studio, and we do consulting under this. And the umbrella that we operate under, the question that we are looking at and moving towards, has to do with how can we transform business to create the world we want our kids to live in? How can we transform business to create the world we want our kids to live in? That's really what's guiding us. And that's from that point of view that we're building tools like the RCO, the Regenerative Community Organism, an organizational form for regenerative business. That's where we build ventures from, and that's where we would consult from as well. And today, as we move into the systemic, and this whole series is called the Regenerative Business Transformation. So there's a map for where we're headed, and we're on this journey. And last week, Nils took us through the personal transformation that could happen, or that some of us might be on around in the topic of work and business. And today, we're going to move into the systemic aspects of work and business, the systemic aspect of work and business transformation. And next week, we will look at the relational aspects. And the reason for us to move to the systemic right now is that it feels like whatever we're doing together, however we are interacting, which seems very central, the relational stuff, it's dependent on who we think we are as people, who I am, who is me, who is self. And it depends on the context, the systemic context of where we are. What is an organization? What's a culture? What's allowed to do? What is the type of conversation that we have? So that's the systemic. And so, yeah, we're starting the personal, jumping to the systemic, and then coming back to the relational, the stuff that connects. And then we have plans. We'll be doing more of these 3-session series going forward. One is culture and worldview, and one will be economy and society. But I'm not going to say more about that right now. So before we get into me talking about some ideas or perspectives on this systemic shift or systemic situation that we seem to be in at the moment, I wanted to allow you to kind of feel into what's happening. And there's this idea, there's a theory, there's a smart guy somewhere in the world, it's called Zach Stein, and he said something like, we live in a time between worlds. And that's a concept that's been there, a time between worlds. And some people say it's a time when the old world is dying and the new world is yet to be born. But we live in a time between worlds. What if we live in a time between worlds? If you don't see it that way. So what if? But the first breakout room that I wanted to invite us into is, what is your in between? So just to ground into ourselves, and an invitation to feel into our own in betweens. So in what areas are you confused, and what no longer makes sense? And the reason for doing this is, but it has to do with that when we bring our personal into the systemic, it gets a bit closer. That stuff that's all the way over there and out there and that doesn't have us involved in it, it comes a bit closer. So the confusion, we talked about it even last week, that's a really nice bridge into understanding or starting to look at areas where there is a mismatch. So Nils, will you set up breakout rooms with pairs, and then you'll have 4 minutes, and then we'll close the breakout rooms, but you have 1 minute to come back. So it'll be total of 5 minutes. In what areas are you confused, and what no longer makes sense? And we'll ping you after 1.5 minutes and after 3 minutes respectively. And that would mean that you can kind of, if you feel like that, just check in. Like one person just gets to talk and sense make and like really feel into these questions without interruption, but with the other person witnessing and listening. And then you switch. And then you can kind of sense make and talk together in the last minute. So that's my suggestion for how you could structure the breakout room. In what areas are you confused? What no longer makes sense? 4 minutes, and the person with the shortest hair starts talking. So you don't have to be nice to one another and say hello and do all that stuff. You just start talking, like roll right into it, drop you into the deep end. All right, you sending us out? See you in a bit.
20 sekunder kvar typ.
Very nice. Welcome back. And Nils also pointed out that the series they're freestanding, so it's not, you didn't have to be there. We don't work with FOMO in Innrwrks. You didn't miss anything. You're here for exactly what you need to see. What I would love is to invite a couple of 2 or 3 maybe voices just to share what you noticed. Was there patterns, or this is something that wants to be said? Just unmute and share, like on this topic of confusion or what no longer makes sense. What did you notice? What did you discover?
Okay, I can start. I see that we are a group of people that are very engaged in this and the systemic change, and which includes the climate discussion, of course. But the better part of these groups are women, very intelligent, that have left their jobs as HR/sustainability managers because they don't get the mandate in the management boards. So right now I feel quite disillusioned by intelligent, that we are a group that mostly women that are disillusionized because it's still business as usual with profit and growth on the board.
Thank you.
I can go next. I feel confused about the fact that we just do more and more and more all the time, but it doesn't seem to get us anywhere. We have all this new smart technology that could save us a lot of time to reflect and ponder on things, to make the right decision and do the right things, but we don't use it for that. We're obsessed with maintaining the culture of doing, which I think is super confusing. Doesn't make sense.
Thank you. One more voice.
I can continue.
Please.
I get so confused about that the feeling of awakening in the world, that we get more and more connected to our intuition, to our heart, to our souls, at the same time as we are, as Sabina said, going into more and more effectiveness and slimming organizations and stuff like that. It's like the discrepancy between the worlds, between our inner world and that outer world, is huge, and people are getting sick from this, and we need to become bridges between the worlds, between business and the divine business.
Divine business. Beautiful. Thank you for those windows into and different perspectives. I'm going to move us into the meat of today's lecture, or whatever, I don't know, talk, and see if I can shed some light on the way that we're thinking about the systemic change. And I think one of the things when we talk about the systemic change is, of course, what is even the systemic? What do we mean by the systemic? And one of those, it's like the way that I've been thinking about it and am thinking about it is that it seems to be a set of collective habits. So even though we know better in our personal lives, for some reason when we interact with others, we don't maybe do that fully. I had a very recent conversation on the World of Wisdom podcast with associate professor of KTH called Elina Eriksson, and she said that it's like, how do we break silences? Like, how do we say what we know to be right? Which really relates to that confusion of like, there's two things that's happening at the same time, at least, you know. So the systemic, for me, lives very much in the stuff out there in the structures and the roads maybe that we've built. Actually, I'm going to do that as an example in a minute, but it also relates to the very personal, like the actual, like where it takes me. The roads are a good example, right? Like if you think about a road, if there is a road, would you drive beside the road? Like, what happens when there is a road built? Is it easy or hard to imagine a different road? Or do you question that there is a road right there, and so therefore you have to drive there or go there? So it's like these collective habits or predispositions or places and structures that we've built to be able to do something. And for some reason, some of them feel like they're not serving us anymore. Maybe we're serving them rather. So what I'm intending to do is talk about the systemic. First, I'll take us into a frame that might be very, very familiar to some of you and new to others, and that's called the meta crisis. So just talk briefly through a way of looking at the systemic predicament or the state that we are in at the moment. And then I'll propose 3 different worldview shifts that might help us navigate differently or see different things in this world. And then finally, I'll propose 3 bridges that we're working with as Innrwrks, where we see that actually these worlds meet. Like when we talk about these 3 topics, then the worlds really seem to meet. Like there seems to be interest and attention, and people seem to be curious about what is going on, or like what we mean by things. And so there's room to have a conversation there. Not that we come to the same conclusions always, but at least it's like something that touches upon this existing world, and it seems to be touching upon whatever is to come next. This quote is like one of those quotes that I've spent a lot of time with, and I wanted to offer it as a bit of a crutch to, as we step into like why these things that we're talking about is so important. And Gregory Bateson is he was a wonderful thinker. He passed away in the early 2000s, and he said this thing. He said, "The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think." The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. And this is very central to the hypotheses that I have around systems change and how we can engage and enact and start working with systems change. So the 3 shifts I want to go to the meta crisis first. So a way of describing our current moment. We just brought up the climate crisis, right, for instance. And it's really important that we solve the climate crisis. It's also really important that we solve the biodiversity loss. It's really important that we solve the economic crisis. It's really important that we solve the political crisis and so forth. And this lens is, I don't know actually who's, but Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about it very intelligently. Jonathan Rawson talks about it intelligently. There's a lot of actually really good material on this online if you Google it. So I'm going to do a very short sort of perspective on this. But basically, it's a proposition that, you know, all of these things are actually interconnected. It's not that they are the same reason, but there are underlying causes that drive all of them, and they feed back into one another. We are in a pickle, and a pickle is a place that doesn't have a very concrete or a simple solution, if it even has any solution. But that doesn't mean that we can't do anything, and as we'll see as we progress, it just means that we might have to start thinking differently, and maybe how we approach problems are more important than what we actually do. But what the meta crisis says fundamentally is, we have an economic crisis in a way. We need to grow faster. GDP needs to grow faster in order for systems, for political systems not to collapse. So the economic and political seems to be very related, and also the economic system has a lot of power in the political. So like it defines what the political can decide about. The political may not be able to agree to Paris agreements or different sort of cuts in emissions or cuts in growth or cuts in things like that, and that has a very clear influence on the climate, on the air, on the soil, on the oceans, on our ecology. And that in turn has something to do with the biodiversity crisis. It definitely relates to how species are extinct. And that's a really rapid rate of extinction that's going on at the moment. So it relates to the biodiversity, and the biodiversity and the climate, deterioration of climate, that has something to do with our mental health. It has something to do with how we feel and how we see the world and how we behave and all that stuff. And I mean, there's a mental health epidemic some people are talking about, where it's more depression, more burnout. And that in turn, it might relate to the epistemic climate. So the epistemic climate would be how we consume information. Like, what is the media? What is the social media? What is the type of information that we consume? How do we consume it? Who's curating it? What type of information do we get fed or do we interact with? And that, of course, has something to do with the education system, both the kids, like my kids that are in school, how they're trained and educated, but it also has something to do with how we train, how we go to university. What is the project of a university? Is it about learning? Is it about teaching? What is it about? And so the meta crisis is just a perspective saying that all of these things are actually interrelated. And what if there are underlying causes for, or drivers for, or generator functions for the situation we are in that we could address? And all of these problems and things are interrelated, and they relate to us. They relate to how we see the world and how we are in the world. And that's what I was going to try to talk about today. So I'm proposing that when we talk about systemic shift, for us to have a chance to shift systemically, that rests on the way that we see the world. And this is not something, I mean, I'm going to talk about these three pillars here, but there is a way that we are moving out of, one could say, a rational, certain, and mechanical world, which is very much, at least for me, it's been the world that I've grown up in. Those are the sort of types of models that I've learned. Like, when the world works, oh, that's how the world is. It's rational. And it's certain. We know something about the world. We can know the world. We just have to think about it hard enough. And it's mechanical. Like, a lot of these images that we have seems to have machine analogies. But what if actually that's not quite true? What if we're actually finding out that the world that we live in is actually embodied and is actually uncertain and is actually relational more than anything else? And I wanted to ground this. I'll go into each one of these pillars, and then we'll talk about the bridges. And we'll see if I can make it as tangible as I possibly can. It's not that easy because it gets big very fast. But the first idea of the rational world, and I'm pretty sure like most of you can kind of relate to this. And in a way, it's like, I think when you hear these shifts, you're like, yeah, of course, I know this. Like, this is, of course. But then when you think about it in terms of structures, or how you have to pitch your project to investors, or how you have to apply for funding, or whatever it might be, then there's something else. So it's like the rational aspect is this economic man or economic person, but I guess economic man is what we've been calling it, right? That we can think our way through things, and that's the right way of understanding it. And that is one theory. That has been a very dominant theory in cognitive sciences for the past 100 years. There's another theory, however, and one that's really gaining traction and attention. And I mentioned this book, The Embodied Mind, that was written by Francisco Varela, who was sort of he was the main guy there, and then Eleanor Roche and Evan Thompson were younger in '92, but they're still carrying on the work today. But they're proposing that actually, no, we are not rational. We are not thinking beings. We're embodied beings. And our cognitive processes are very rooted in our body's interactions. So like how we interact with the world and what we do in the world actually affects how we see the world. And so it's basically an invitation to say, trust your body. Like there is such a thing as intuition. Even from a cognitive scientist, very hardcore cognitive scientist perspective, intuition's there. There are other ways of knowing than just thinking about it. And so in a way, you could sum it up as an invitation. This is an invitation for us to relax into sense making. So instead of thinking so hard, what if you just felt your way through? What if there was a different way of knowing? The second shift has to do with knowing, and this might be familiar territory again for some of you, and for some of you it might be new, but there's a way of thinking about the world as, is it knowable? Is it certain? Can I be certain? And if you think about a work situation and you think about how much time we spend to make plans and how much resources we spend to make plans or budgets or whatever it is, something that has to know with knowing the future, where we're kind of saying that these things are knowable. The world is, we can define it. And then there's a different way of behaving and seeing and working in the world, which is more informed by complexity theory or system science. And the Knuffin framework, and Dave Snowden is one of those proponents of that. He's made it quite popular. They're talking about, well, actually, we don't live in a complicated world. It's not that the world is a lot of stuff that's hard to understand. It's actually that the world is a lot of things and they're interrelated in such a way that we can't really understand them. It doesn't mean that we can't know anything. Like there are things that we definitely know. There are things that we can kind of do that make sense. But we can't know fully what it is. Like it is a complex world, and that means that the context always matters. And so what would you do if you, instead of trying to know all of it, just knew enough? What if you just focused on figuring out what are the things that we know and what are the things that we don't know? So there's a invitation here as well to relax into knowing, and also maybe accept and relax into the not knowing. Not everything is knowable. That's the second shift. And then the third has to do with this shift from the mechanical to the relational. And I love this. I had a very sort of influential thinker and writer called Jude Currivan on the podcast, the World of Wisdom podcast, and she's working with the UN, and she's working in a lot of systemic different contexts where they're doing some really wonderful change work. And she said, we live in a world, we live in a quantum world with 19th century mechanic institutions. A lot of the institutions that we have today, the political systems, the economic systems and so forth, actually stem from the early 1800s or a little bit earlier than that. And that was a very different world. Just from a physical point of view, the way we understood the world and the physics that were underpinning it was mechanical. The thermodynamic world is mechanical. It's very different from the quantum world, the quantum physics theory world that we are currently living in. And one of the easiest ways, for me at least, to start thinking about the world in other terms than the mechanical has been to not focus so much on the parts, but actually focus on how they're connected. So looking at relationships, patterns, contexts, and how they intra-afford each other, how they have to do with each other, what type of flow happens between these parts. That's a better way of looking at the world. It's closer to the reality. So Donatella Meadows is one of those people. Gregory Bateson again, and Fritjof Capra are other proponents. Those are people you can kind of look up or take a look at. There's a lot to read on this. But what if we actually live in a relational world? And I mean, if you think about it, actually, if you've been like fundraising, I'm just taking that as an example. If you talk to an investor, when you really sit with them, usually what they say is like, oh, we know there's a lot of uncertainty, and like when we invest in you, we invest in the team. So there's even this idea in sort of the investment world where we're saying like we're investing in the relationships, like we trust you as an individual. The idea is great, like you need to kind of do the work, but ultimately, if the team is great, we know that you're going to pull through. So what would happen if we would relax into that interdependence? The idea that we actually need others, we need one another, and maybe even the idea that without others, we don't necessarily there's nothing that's going to be done. So what if the world is actually relational, and what if we would take more time to focus on how we relate to other things and people instead of take time to talk about the stuff, the objects. So I'm going to talk very briefly about these bridges, because I think by this I've kind of already mentioned them, but the bridges between the paradigms. So we're moving from a rational, certain, and mechanical world into a different world that's embodied, uncertain, and relational. And what seems to work really well, something that's very important in both of these worlds, are these three concepts. Efficiency came up, or even in the uncertainty. But how we define efficiency in the rational, certain, and mechanical world is quite different from how we define efficiency in the embodied, uncertain, relational world. So in the new world, so to say, efficiency might have to do with how we talk to one another, like how we can actually harvest the diversity that we have, how we can hear one another, what are the perspectives, what are we able to see. If I realize that I can't see everything and that I don't know the world, then I need others to understand the world. And if I can understand the world and build relationships, then there can be interdependence. I mean, you can see that in network theory or whatever. And if we do these things together, then we build resilience. And resilience, that actually allows us to deal with things like risk. And so a network world that allows us to do the right things would also be a less risky world, maybe, because the fall might not be as big. We might not risk as much as we fall. And then there, of course, we can also talk about value, like both, of course, in the soft sense, what do we value? But I think, again, it's like one of those things, Sabine, I think you said it, when we started out, like we do more, but we don't get anywhere. But it seems to be that what is the type of value that we're trying to capture? What is the type of value that we're looking at in these systems? So what if we can talk about, I think most of us that run companies or have been working with companies know that the top line isn't the value that the company delivered. The price isn't the entire value of the product. If that was the case, then, I mean, it even says actually in economic theory, right? The price is what you pay, which is the difference between sort of the excess value, right? You're willing to pay for the value that you will be getting, like the additional value that the product would give you. So there's something there that's not captured in money. But like, can we talk about value in a different way? Nils, I'm gonna do my call a friend card and ask if you wanna butt in and ground this in some way. Are you there?
I'm here. I'm just
cool.
pondering. I don't have a lot to add in this moment. What comes up for me as you ask this question to me right now is perhaps just the invitation to really kind of spend a moment with these three words and bridges, and potentially just invite, like, how am I thinking about efficiency in the structures where I find myself, in the systems that I interact with. What is the narrative around efficiency within me and around me and between us? How do I think about it? And then the same for risk and value. Like, what are the risks that I am afraid of? And what are the risks that we are afraid of when we are together in a structure, in a system, in a company, in an organization, in an educational institution, whatever the system is that we find ourselves in? Like, what are the risks that are we have agreed upon, and what are the risks that are personally, deeply personal to me? And then the same, obviously, for value. Like, what do I actually value? And is there currently room for all of those values in the systems where I find myself? Is there a narrative around it? Is there an exploration? Are we measuring things or not? Can it even be measured? Do we have to measure it? Just, maybe in silence, if we feel we have time for that, just like 20 seconds of just sitting with words and allowing them to maybe sink a little bit deeper than just your mind. Speaking of the embodied and the relational. So there's that, just allowing this shared field that we have right now to be with the words, if that's okay.
And perhaps also remind us of that quote, that initial proposal, that the major problems in the world has to do with the difference between how the world works and how we think about the world. Or how we think, actually. So even in ourselves, that stuff that doesn't make sense, you might be forced to think about or communicate efficiency in a particular way, in a particular context, and risk and value. I think I'm going to move us into 2 frameworks that we've been leaning on for doing this work, when we're not talking about it, but actually trying to implement it and working with it in context. Both of them are from Carol Sanford. It's very annoying with this little thing that pops up. Both of them are from Carol Sanford. Both of them are from the same book, Indirect Work, but they're very interesting and very simple. And so it's just 2 ways of allowing us to think about these things. And then we're going to do another breakout, and then we're going to be done. The first one is this: consciousness, capacity, culture. So what she's proposing is that what we are able to pay attention to, so our embodied beings, our embodied minds, shows us certain things, and that is the capacities that we build. So what we think that we need to know and what we think that we need to do has to do with what we see. And what we're doing, what our capacity takes us to do, actually is the culture and the system that we're living in. And the culture then reveals to us what we can see. So if we are only acting as business people, if we are only in a context of business, then that's probably what we're going to be seeing, because that's the culture. But if you take your business question and sit on a mountaintop, or go to a monastery or church, or even to your kid's soccer game, that business problem might look very different. So it's just an invitation to look at these 3 things create one another, and our worlds are contextual. So if we need new perspectives, then we can just remove the problem from the context and look at it somewhere else. And to frame something, I have this problem, I have this issue, I have this question that I'm focusing on. What am I seeing? What do I know or have? What capacities do I have? And how does that fit with what we think we need to do, or what the story is that I need to do to address this problem? That's the first tool. And then the second tool is this one, which is a proposal that there are 4 different levels of minds, or different processes that are ongoing in our day-to-day. We have concrete objects out there that we can interact with and see. Things, basically. The things minds is like the contract, or the business, or the deal, or the coffee cup, or the phone, right? But those things, are they really things, or are they like they came to you, or they were made by something? The reason why they look like they're looking is because of some process that's ongoing. They were manufactured somewhere. It's cheaper to make chips in China, something like that. It has something to do with, there's a process by which the thing was made. So there's always a question of like, okay, but do you know anything about that process? And regardless of if you notice it or not, it's ongoing. And the process can do certain things and it can't do other things. And the thing with that process is that it's underpinned by relationships. It's underpinned by who you were talking to, who was in the room, who was listening. What are the relationships that are making up the process? So when we speak together in this room, something's possible. If you would have the same conversation with the board of innovation at some association, or an industry association, or whatever it might be, it might look very differently. So the relationship that you have, it influences which type of process that you can engage in, and which process you engage in influences which type of things that you can make, what you can imagine. And all of this is underpinned by essence. And it's really interesting to start looking at, if we're stuck somewhere, if I'm stuck and thinking like, oh, I can't make this company work, this thing work. Wait, what's the process by which I've been doing this? Wait, who's been involved? Who have I asked? What if I would ask someone else, or talk to someone else? Wait, what's the purpose of this thing? You know, what is the abstract level, which is also why we're starting with a question. What is actually the question? What's the center of this? What am I trying to do? What is this about? And usually that reveals space for us to move. So this is a really wonderful framework. And with that, I'm going to pass on to you, Nils, and take us out into the last breakout room before we close.
Beautiful. And a small add to that last model is also, essence can be viewed in the context of what is the purpose of this. It can also be viewed as your inner essence, your soul, whatever you want to call that thing that is you, at the core of you. And from that, when you bring that essence into your relationships, then the relationships change and there's more potential. There's other type of potential, depending on how much of your essence you are willing or able or daring enough to bring into it, and so on, just to your point. So the last little breakout that we're inviting us all to do here is to explore this question. So bring it back to you. You as a human being, you as a personal experience, what could you relax that potentially would increase your agency or your potential? What could you relax?
I'm not sure I understand.
Good. So it's both an invitation to bring this question and interpret it in any way you like, but to add some potential clarification. Is the topic that Amit has been pointing towards here is that there's a thread of relaxation from the rational to the embodied. For instance, when we relax into the experience and I bring my entire body into it. One example could be, I could relax my body, I could relax my mind in the meetings that I have. Maybe as an example here, I'm not trying to, impact your exploration here, but to answer your question, Samina, maybe I'm not fully relaxing into the moment when I'm in a business meeting. Maybe I am thinking really hard about the thing that we've decided, the object that we've decided that we wish to achieve, which could be a result or an effect, the 20% increase of our result or something like that. And I need to think about it, and I also need to make it happen, because what will happen to me otherwise? Maybe I'll get fired, or people will criticize me because I didn't make the thing happen that we agreed upon. And in that state, usually we're not really relaxed into the moment. We're using this part of ourselves, and we're really, I'm pointing to my head here. We're pushing for it. We're trying to make it work. It's not a relaxed state. So that's one example, potentially, where maybe I can relax just more into the embodied experience. What am I sensing? What am I smelling? What am I seeing? Not thinking too much about the thing. That's an example. And then maybe, yeah, good. I'll stop there. If anyone else needs some kind of clarification, let me know.
So agency in this matter means way forward or rationale, or it's not a design agency per se. It's a way going forward, right?
Yeah, agency could be seen kind of as an energy, right? When I have agency, I end up doing things because I feel that I wish to do things, and I move things and I shift things, and things happen within me and around me. That's one way to kind of interpret agency. So we know it's a tricky question, because it's a question that hopefully potentially is pointing us towards this emerging world where we're not comfortable. So I'm not surprised to have these reactions to the question. And agency can be seen as potential, yes. It can definitely be linked to it. When that energy arises in me and I do something, then potentially the potential increases.
Agency might be where we can move, where we're not stuck.
Yeah, so that's good. Another way to frame it could be, what could I relax that would make me less stuck? All right, we'll leave it there. I'll give you a few minutes to explore this. I'll put you into breakouts again in a little moment here. And you have 2 minutes each. Again, does that make sense? We have 7 minutes left in total, if we push it a little bit here. But 2 minutes just to give you an opportunity to explore this, and then we'll wrap it up quickly. All right. Let it done.
Welcome back. And we are short in time, and I'm going to wrap up super quick. And I still wanted to invite one short voice if there's something that needs to be said right now.
Yeah, I could go. So I think that I need to relax my rational mind and move more into my intuition and my subconscious in order for me to increase my agency and get less stuck, as Nils would put it. So that's about it. Thank you.
Beautiful. And as we sent you out, I expressed to Nils my frustration and feeling of how difficult it is to talk about these things in a way that makes sense, in like a rational, senseful way. And then at the same time, that's kind of the proof of the pudding. It's very hard to grasp with your mind. And at the same time, I kind of trust that you feel this in some way. So, wrapping up very quickly, but yet carefully, full of care, we've now come through the personal and the systemic. And next week on the 28th, we'll be doing the relational. And to follow up this whole series, we'll also present a tool that Innrwrks has that we are working with, which is the RCO, this organizational model that we've designed that's been getting some attention, at least on some parts of the LinkedIn universe lately. So that's the journey that we're on, and we'll follow up with an email with this recording and with some resources that we've been pointing to. And yeah, just thank you for showing up and for leaning in and for being confused together. And I really appreciate the opportunity to try to make sense out of this. And I don't know if we failed or if we succeeded, but I'm hoping that you brought something with you. And thanks for doing this. Hope to see you again next week.
So much. Thank you.
Thank you for holding space.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
Guys. You.
Cheers.